Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Pastor Mark here with Midday with Mark. Not quite midday, sorry. Have to apologize for the last 2 days, but been up to a lot of stuff ministry-wise. Hat looks crooked. Up to a lot of stuff ministry-wise, so fix the hat. Let's see. There you go. Doing a lot of things ministry-wise, so hey, getting back to you finally. Sorry again that I've been kind of off the radar for the last couple days. This is Midday with Mark, day 36. That's right, day 36. Let me fix this a little bit. Day 36, and we are at our last week, our last day, I should say, our last day of Nehemiah. So our final day of our Nehemiah study. This is part 13 of that study here in pandemic Pittsburgh, Corona Coriopolis, where I'm at right now. Pandemic Pennsylvania. Sooner or later, we're going to get out of our houses. But welcome. Glad you're here. Give people a moment to jump on. We're not going to do a book today because I got a lot of stuff in this chapter to wrap up. It's part 13. It's chapter 13. So if you have your Bible with you, if you're watching this live or you're watching it later, love to have you comment, say whatever, say hello, welcome, glad you're here. So part 13, but we do have a pop for today. Well, kind of. So every day I show a pop because I collect pops. And so we show the pops, but today I'm not going to show a pop. It's kind of in the same vein. It's called vinyl idols. They're bigger than pops. They're like this big, and they're different things. And this is one of my all-time favorite pieces. So are you ready? Here we go. All right. So maybe you remember this movie. It's one of my favorite movies. It's iconic. What I'm about to show you is iconic. It's been spoofed probably a bazillion times or used in different contexts a bazillion times. But here it is. It's a vinyl idol. It is our own Lloyd Dobler from Say Anything. Lloyd, all vol and noid, all null and void from the movie. You might remember that. Lloyd Dobler, the iconic boombox over the head, serenading his love from the movie Say Anything. Awesome moment there, Lloyd Dobler. So enjoy all that. Enjoy all a little bit of Lloyd. Not quite a pop. It's a lot bigger than a pop. See how big it is? I mean, look how I know I have a big head, so you can really see how big it is. So, yep, little Lloyd Dobler for you there. So, welcome to the final part of Nehemiah. Tomorrow we'll do something new. Again, sorry about being late today. We were out actually delivering stuff to people in our church. So sorry, that was for a good cause though. So, and sorry about missing the day before. Again, church stuff got in the way. I know this is church stuff, but glad you're here. So we're at Nehemiah, last part, Nehemiah 13, chapter 13. All right. So let me back up to last one. If you haven't watched Midday with Mark 35, this is Midday with Mark 36. If you haven't watched 35, let me give you a little. So Nehemiah here is at the end. He's rebuilt the wall. People have made promises. That was the title of the last one. They made promises to God, okay, about some certain things they wouldn't do. They wouldn't intermarry with people from other races. And you might think, well, wait, that sounds racist. It wasn't racist because what they were commanded to do was not intermarry with people outside the faith, because if they did that, what always happened in the history of Israel is they would take on the gods of the people that they married. So look, you've heard the phrase, like, when you marry her, you marry her whole family, or you marry him, you marry his whole family. You marry more than that. You don't just marry their family, you marry their gods, their beliefs. And so they were told not to intermarry for that very reason, because Israel got led astray many times because of their following of false gods. They were told not to work on the Sabbath. So we talked about relationships, money. Okay, that was one of their big hangups. They were told to stop working on the Sabbath, that they needed to rest. They needed to set time away from God, or with God, not away from God, with God. And then they also needed to take care of God's house. So they were commanded to take care of God's house and to bring their first fruits, to bring their first crops into the storehouse of the temple, because those those were used in different ways in the temple, but also distributed to the poor. Also, so it was charity. So they were called to be generous people. Okay, so they were called to have good, right relationships. They were called to take care of God's temple and to live generously. And they were also called not to work on the Sabbath, to set aside time for their family, for God, all those things. So those were the promises they made in chapter 2. All right. So let's look at chapter 3 to wrap this up. Last chapter in Nehemiah. Here's how it goes. So after they make all those promises, this is what it says. On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. Now, again, that's going to sound like racism, okay? There's a couple things going on here, okay? Again, they were called not to intermingle with foreign gods, and this is what had led them into a lot of messed up stuff. And so they had to make a decision: am I going to get pulled away into this stuff, or am I going to walk in the way that God has commanded me? Now, so I want you to get this. God's heart has always been for all of the nations. Like all the way back, you go back to Abraham. Abraham has said that from you, Abraham, will come one who will bless all people, all nations. We know that as Jesus, as Christians, that from the seed of Abraham, Jesus came and he blessed all nations, all tribes, all languages. Okay. You look at the book of Jonah, you have God who has a heart for, oh gosh, is it Babylonians? Oh man, I'm like totally blanking on that. But Jonah is sent to oh my gosh. Yeah, this is getting old. But Jonah is sent to Nineveh, right? He's sent to the town of Nineveh. He cares nothing for these people. And God says, shouldn't I care? I care, Jonah. I care about these people. Shouldn't you care? And so God's heart has always been a missionary heart all throughout the scripture. How he accomplishes that is different, because we live post Jesus. So remember, these people are living before Messiah too. The Messiah who's saying things like, love your enemies, love your neighbors yourself. So when you read the Old Testament, you have to realize they're operating on somewhat of a different principle in some ways than you. God still had a heart for everyone, but they are living under some different principles. Okay, there's some Old Testament justice in here. We live in a different area. In this progressive revelation, we live post Jesus. Okay, so then it says this, verse 4. Before this, Elishib the priest, so there was a priest named Elishib, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah. Okay, now if you remember our study, there are 3 black hats, not this one, but there are 3 enemies, kind of villains in this story: Tobiah, Geshem, and Sanballat. Okay, so what Nehemiah is telling you here is the priest was in cahoots with one of the villains of the story. And he says he was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil prescribed for the Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. Okay, so he's telling you right here that already there's compromises being made. They made promises, but you're going to see that the people of God always kind of slide back from their promises. They always kind of slide away. They had this big rah-rah pep rally. Everybody's like, yeah, go God, woohoo. And then they start to slowly fade away from that. So he's beginning to tell you there's corruption already sneaking its foot back in. So he says, but while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah tells you he wasn't there. So when the cat's away, the mice will play. When the leader's away, people start compromising. Okay? So he says, while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Sometime later, I asked permission and came back to Jerusalem. I don't know how long that time was. Maybe it tells us somewhere, but I don't know exactly how long he was gone from Jerusalem. Okay? And he came, and I came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Elisha had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. So Nehemiah evicts Tobiah. He evicts him. He's like, you're out. You were never supposed to be here. And the only reason you're here is because there's corrupt people who've begin to let this garbage sneak back in. Okay? Throws him out of the room. Gave orders to purify the rooms. Like, man, spray it down. Disinfect it. Coronavirus, disinfect it, right? He's like, Tobiah is a virus. Man, we got to even disinfect the room we kicked him out of, all right? Clean it out, purify it, and then put back in there the stuff that belongs, the things of God, with the grain offerings and the incense, okay? Now, so we see there's a personal problem. There's a personal thing to happen, which is an indication of a bigger problem. Okay, so watch this. Verse 10. Of 13. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. Why do they leave the temple? Why do they leave Jerusalem and go back to their own fields? Because the people aren't taking care of the house of God. They don't have anything to eat. They're not making a wage. They're not making money. They can't eat. So they got to go home to work the fields. They're the people in charge of the temple. So you can see this. They've started to let go of the responsibilities back in chapter 12 they said they would do. He says, I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. So he's like, you guys, I left. And you didn't take care of the house of God. Don't you remember what you said? Don't you remember? And he said, so once Nehemiah is back, it says, all the Judah brought their tithes of grain, new wine, and oil into the storerooms. And Nehemiah sets all this up to make sure the temple is running again. And then he says this. See, here's the thing. The title of this is Remember Me Today. Okay? We should say, help me remember. That's also, there's two lessons today. Help me remember, God, what I promised to do. And Nehemiah, after all of his hard work, he says to God, remember me. Here in verse 14, he says, remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. Nehemiah says, please, God, remember me. Remember this was my heart. Remember this is what I want to do. But there's a warning here too for us that we need to remember our promises we make to God. We need to remember because evil will creep back into our lives. Slowly, over time, it will just creep in. It'll get a foothold and then it'll just creep in. And, remember, this is an Old Testament story too. We know that God is with us always in a very personal way through Jesus. They didn't have that luxury. They didn't have that luxury. Yes, they knew God was with them. But I think you see some of this Nehemiah pleading with God to remember him, because I think there's just some things in the Old Testament where they just kind of wonder. They just kind of wonder. It's something that us on the other side of Jesus shouldn't really wonder. God's with us. He's with us because he's Emmanuel, God with us. He came in the flesh. Nehemiah never saw that. Nehemiah never got to see that. It's like Job in the book of Job crying out, if only God was a man like me. And we could say to Job, now he was. Job, he became a man like you. He suffered like you. But Job didn't see that. Job didn't know that. But we do. So let's go on and finish this. Then he says this in verse 15. In those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath. and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. So you get this? The very thing they promised. This is promise number 2. I said, we promised we would stop working on the Sabbath. And guess what they start doing? They start forgetting the Sabbath, and they're back to working on the Sabbath. See, that's promise number 2. They've forgotten that one. Okay? They've crept back into their old ways. Okay? And then he says this, therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. And it goes on, he rebukes them. He's like, what is this wicked thing you are doing? Desecrating the Sabbath. Didn't your ancestors do the same things? Now get this. He says, didn't our ancestors do the same things so that our God brought all of this calamity on us and on this city? Do you hear what he's saying? He's like, haven't you all learned anything? Like, haven't you learned? This is why we're in the mess we're in, because we walked away from God. And when you walk away from God, this is where you end up. And it's not like most people, when they walk away from God, just like they go from one, like I'm walking with God, and the next day they're in Las Vegas, baby. Like doing everything you could possibly do. It's not like people usually walk away from God like that. It is usually a slow slope, slowly away. It wasn't like they had went from singing in the choir to in the middle of the Vegas Strip in one day. They got there because they slowly walked away. And he says, don't you realize this is how we got here in the first place? This is how God warned us over and over again that we were walking away and that we need to return. He says, now you're stirring up more wrath against Israel. You're testing God. You're putting God's patience to the test. See, don't tempt the Lord your God. Don't test the Lord your God. I mean, like, look, Jesus is in the desert. The devil says to him, why don't you do this? And the Lord will take care of you. And Jesus is like, don't put your Lord your God to the test. Now, there is one thing where God says, test me, and that is in our giving. He says, test me and see that I'm faithful, and I will. And I think that the reason that's the only thing he says to test in, because it's the one thing we usually struggle with the most, is our money. Anyway, that's a side thing. Anyway. So he warns all these people, hey, we need to change this. We got to stop working on the Sabbath, because we're supposed to set this aside for each other and for God. And then again, he says, remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. And we would say to Nehemiah, you have God's mercy. You have God's love. And we should know this in our hearts. In Jesus, we have God's mercy. We have God's love. He's with us always. He is Emmanuel, God with us. And then here's the final thing. He says, moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of those other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. Here we go. Third promise broken. He's like, we promised that we wouldn't marry foreign women. Because when we marry foreign women, we marry their gods. We talked about this a couple days ago. Just like when you marry an unbeliever, like you, me, if we would marry an unbeliever, you're marrying their way of life, what they think is important, what they value. And it won't be the same thing often you value. Notice what it says here. The people had forgotten their own language. Why? Because they're speaking now a language, and language is deeply tied into our beliefs. And so they've already started to slide away from even their own language. See, I think, look, when you lose God in your life, you lose your native tongue. This is the tongue you were meant to speak. Praise to God. Your mouth was meant to bring praise and honor and glory to God. When you lose that language, you lose a relationship with God. You lose the ability to communicate with God. He says, these people have forgotten how to speak their own language. He said, I rebuked them and called curses on them. Again, remember, this is Old Testament. I beat some of the men. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. Remember, Old Testament justice, some of it. Is it right? No. But these guys, I guess, needed a good beating. And they need to lose some hair. I need to lose some hair. Maybe Nehemiah could rip out some of my hair. Anyway. And he said, I make them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. He says, it's already too late for you. You've already broken this, but don't let your sons or daughters do this. Was it not because of the marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Yeah, like Solomon had a woman problem, like a big one. And they all led him astray, away from God, into all kinds of craziness. He says, among the many nations there was no king like him, like Solomon. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel, but even he was led into sin by foreign women. So even the wisest man of all, Solomon, was led astray by having bad relationships. Must we hear now that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? One of the sons of Jobiah, son of Elishab, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat. There's another one of the axis of evil, Sanballat. So the high priest was son-in-law to Sanballat. He married Sanballat's daughter, one of the priests. And I drove him away from me. It was like, all right, this is going crazy. And then verse 29, he says, remember then, my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. So he says, even the priests defiled and broke their promise. That's what corruption is like. Corruption goes to everybody. And then verse 30 says, so I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duties, each to his own task. I also made provisions for contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruits. And so these are Nehemiah's final words. Hi, Mike. And Nehemiah closes his book by saying, remember me with favor, my God. Remember me with favor, my God. So to wrap up Nehemiah today, these people broke their promises. They didn't follow what they said they'd do. And my encouragement to you today is to seek the Lord with all your heart. I believe Nehemiah did this. He sought the Lord with all his heart. To give your life over to him. To give your life over to him. Okay? And then to walk with him each day and realize that you and I will both be tempted, and we've all done this. We've all failed. We're all tempted to slide away, okay? Slide away into things that aren't good for us. Now, Nehemiah beat these guys up and pulled out their hair. And I don't think God's going to do that to you. I don't think anybody's going to come along and do that to you, but I think God will pull us back. I think he'll pull us back to our promises. And so this has been a great time going through Nehemiah. I hope you've enjoyed walking through Nehemiah. And Nehemiah closes with, remember me with favor, my God. And I want you all to know that God does remember you with favor. We live in a different time than Nehemiah lives. We live in a post-Jesus world where everything we know has been changed by the Son of God. Nehemiah never knew that. And so I think Nehemiah did not have as much revelation as you have. You have more revelation than the disciples even had. You have all of this right here for you to know that God will remember you, know that God never forgets you, and know that his mercy and grace is abundant to you. And so Nehemiah teaches us some great lessons about leadership, about promises, about building your life on the word of God, about rebuilding we will have to rebuild. You will have to rebuild. And I pray that what you rebuild from here on out is better than what came before. I was talking to somebody today, Lisa Burford, who watches this. When I dropped something off at her house, she was talking about, we're going to a new normal. And I think that new normal will be better than the old one. The new normal will be better. And it will be better if we build it on the right things. That's on Jesus and his word. That's my prayer for you. Thanks for being here for this whole Nehemiah series. If you want to watch all 13 parts, go back and watch them. Comment here. Anything you'd like to say, comment on this. Love to hear from you. Love to hear your thoughts. Tomorrow, we'll finish up Midday with Mark for this week with something brand new. See you tomorrow on Friday. If you're a guy watching this, we have Bible study tonight, 7 o'clock on Zoom. Join us. Love to have you. Peace out. Again, sorry for being late today. Sorry for no Midday with Mark yesterday, but I'll see you tomorrow, I promise, noon. All right, guys. See you later. Before the polar vortex comes this weekend. Crazy. Stay warm. Stay safe. Be wise. Faith over fear. Bye.